break. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sustainability Summit. I hope you have been sharing your thoughts on our social media platforms at hashtag SUSWeek21. It has been a jam-packed day, but I truly hope that you've been engaging with the content that has been presented thus far. We've asked a lot of thought-provoking questions, but hold on tight. Don't go anywhere because it's about to get a bit heated. We are talking sustainable infrastructure, and to kickstart our conversations, we have an incredible and an expert in the field who will be providing a keynote address, and also will be giving us leeway for us to introduce our other panelists that will be joining us. But to really lay the foundation for the segment, we have Mr. Tony Hidley, founder of Tony Hidley African Advisory, and he will be telling us or taking us through the sustainable infrastructure segment as we close off the day. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good evening if you're somewhere else in the world. So I'm going to give a talk on well, firstly, a little bit of background. I've been invited by PPC, the cement company in South Africa, to give this presentation around what is happening in sustainability in our industry and in the part of the industry relevant to infrastructure. So firstly, we're in a period in the cement industry of probably the most significant transformation we've ever seen in our industry. That is partially just a discipline, a focus on what really matters for the businesses. And over the last 18 to 24 months, a dramatic increase in the approach to dealing proactively, much more aggressively on the topics of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So we're going to explore a few of those ideas as we go through. So I'd just like to talk about complacency. I joined the cement industry in '99, and one of my first trips was to Nigeria in my role of the African boss of Blue Circle, which later became Lafarge. And I was pushing already for performance, already on ESG, because those were part of my values where I'd been working before. And we were having discussions about a way to significantly reduce the amount of CO2 per ton of cement sold into the market. And my guys have been saying to me, no, we can't do this. This is not possible. It's a technical issue, big technical issue. And I was new in cement. The industry was a very staid, very boring, very fat, lazy, heavy business. And I apologize for that, but that was the way it was in those days. And so I said, well, let's go visit a client. And in the client office or client factory, they were using our cement. And when I saw them using our cement, I noticed a mill in the corner, and they were grinding limestone. And I said, why are you grinding limestone? What are you doing with that? And they said, we need to add it to your cement because it performs better when we add limestone to our cement. So I said, get quiet, went back to the office and said, guys, you've just been telling me that it's absolutely wrong and impossible to do this, and here our client is doing it. We're missing a huge opportunity, both from an economic benefit and a CO2 benefit. So life changed. So I think complacency, the way it's always been done, has been one of the biggest barriers in the broader construction sector. There's a lot of things which have always been done that way. And I think the biggest challenge we face and will face over the coming 5, 10, 15 years is breaking down that we've always done it that way, whether that's the engineer, whether it's the architect, whether it's a standards organization, whether it's the cement companies, whether it's the ready-mix companies. And I think complacency is a real issue, perhaps across many industries, but certainly from cement into concrete, into construction, and the general area around buildings. So that, again, that's over 20 years ago. We were heavily into that problem. So we're going to talk a little bit about the environmental side. And I think we start with a rather shocking statement that cement is 9% of global emissions of CO2, 9%. And that's 2.6 billion tons per year approximately. So we are the biggest individual sector, together with iron and steel. Utilities is obviously a very broad topic. It also relates a lot to construction, because a lot of that is the power, the heat, the water, the cooling in the buildings which are built from our products. And our products, often cement, very closely related to iron and steel in buildings. So I think what still shocks me 21 or 22 years into the industry is operational performance is still very poor, be that industrial performance and commercial performance. So I think the industry can already do a great deal just through improving the performance to reduce that 9%. There are then some new proven technologies. We'll touch on one or two of them as we go through, which can also take out quite significant amounts of CO2 from our industry. Then it gets tougher, then it gets more complex, then it gets, it ultimately becomes many different levers you have to pull in order to make progress. So just to give some flash information, I won't dwell on this because it's perhaps not topics that you're particularly aware of, but on those two charts, you look at the green and you look at the red. The green is the best industrial performance, either one of those charts. One is overall CO2, the other is thermal energy, which is the biggest controllable source of CO2. So those green sides, you can see for the last, since 1990, so for the last 30 odd years, there's been not much progress at getting better at the best end. On the worst end, there's been, where the red circle is, there's been a lot of progress. That's basically old plants closing down. But what's rather surprising is, with all the new plants built, the big modern plants built in the third world, we haven't seen a bigger advancement in the green sector. So we look at a couple of other points. There are, when you make cement, you make an intermediate product called clinker. All the factories in South Africa, they produce clinker. They then mix the clinker with gypsum, which is to get the process happening, and with what we call extenders, in order to reduce the amount of clinker per ton of cement or cementitious, because that is the most critical factor. And what is quite shocking is the lack of progress of the lack of progress that we see over the years. If you look at the energy consumption, you can see the energy consumption, the average has come down from 4,500 to 3,300, more or less. Now, PPC sitting at 3,600. It's quite dependent on your portfolio, your historical portfolio of plants, but it's also how you run the business. Alternate fuels. There are many plants in the world using alternate carbon zero or low carbon fuels, biomass, industrial waste, etc., running 100% on that. But if we look in the middle chart, the very middle chart there, we see that there's still less than 20% substitution globally. People are just not yet serious enough. And if we look at the clinker to cement ratio, in other words, the lower that percentage, the better it is, we see absolute platforming over the last 10 years. So we've got real issues on the ability to reduce some of these numbers. Why? Historically, maintaining barriers to entry, the big cement companies would try desperately to keep the barriers high. Secondly, poor industrial performance, just bad management of plants in many parts of the world. We've seen many terribly performing plants. And then, as I highlighted a little bit earlier, the failure of the sector to transform. Well, we've always built big overweight. We've always had high safety factors. We've always decided to use low performance concrete rather than very high performance concrete. So I think for us to transform into a truly sustainable, moving towards a zero carbon position, it's mainly about mindset. We have the solutions. We can do whatever we need to make it happen. It's all about the mindset. Now, I think the good news is in the last 6 to 12 months, that mindset has really started changing. Led, as we'll explain, probably by investors, not governments, not the leadership, but investors who penalize the shares of the companies who are seen not to be performing. Just again, to highlight a little bit why I talk about the shocking performance. If you look at those 4 charts, they all highlight very significant discrepancies between the best in class and the worst in class. The top charts on the basis of regions, continents, and you can see Africa is actually performing rather well, perhaps because standards are broader, they're not so rigid, and you can make changes quicker, and people are more willing to change in Africa. And then again, we see in the 2 charts at the bottom there, we see significant differences between best in class. The bottom left chart, the 2 best in class are in India. India's stunning in that particular measure. They are very, very good. Whereas far left, GCC, Titan, that's mainly a US influence. The US has got firstly, some different ways of measuring things, and secondly, some different rules and regulations which allow for different positionings. So you've got to be a bit careful on all of these benchmarks, but there are significant differences between best in class and worst in class. And again, we highlight here similarly power consumption, overall CO2, and yes, at the moment, PPC is a bit on the high side, so we've got to drive that down, and I think the management is working very hard on improving that position. There's some modern capacity, some of the older capacity being closed, and the transformation is in hand. So where do we look at ambition? So we've seen very, very slow progress on what is the core measure, so that kilograms of CO2 per ton of cement sold. And that cement obviously gets sold to be made into concrete. So this is a fairly robust benchmark. It does have regional differences. It does have some standards differences. But fundamentally, we are seeing the industry start to get more aggressive. And if we look at the actual, we can see a variance between the best, today Holcim 550, and the worst, Bootsy, at almost 700. So very significant performance differences on actual. And then if we look at the ambition, we look at the targets from the best in class 550, the 2030 target of Heidelberg is 500, and of Cemex 475. So in reality, targets are moving. Those targets have shifted already once or sometimes twice in the last 12 months. So we are seeing progress in the targets, but in order to become carbon zero, we need significantly more action on that front. So what I think we're seeing is a number of organizations working across the industry or even across industries working on targets. I don't think the ambition is still big enough. And the EIA roadmap, which was a big effort done between EIA and the industry, forecast a 2050 position for the percentage of clinker in cement, and I still don't think that is anything like ambitious enough. Sorry, the next slide. So let's look on some of the positive stuff. Let's say what is happening on the environmental side on innovation. And I give some examples from across the globe here. Holcim announced on Monday that their eco cement that they released very recently in India already has a 5% market penetration, and it's selling at a price premium. Also recently, Holcim showed a 3D printed bridge. And the benefit of 3D printing in concrete is the fact that you have much less wastage, because the average building site, you've all seen building sites and how horribly messy and wasteful they seem and indeed are. So I think, and this technology of 3D printing, not only was it innovative, it also used no reinforcing bar, which is another big benefit on going back to more classical architectural design. Uganda, there's a cement plant in Uganda, which I've known very well for many, many years. They're the most advanced plant using coffee husks as their fuel. They substitute, I think, about 60% now of their fuel. And it's been the case for something like 18 or 20 years now. So great things can be done, but no one else anywhere in Africa has got anywhere close to the performance of that. Morocco, the wind farm feeding electricity to a plant in Morocco, that was the first wind farm supplying cement plants in the continent. PPC are working on a solar project in Zimbabwe. We are working, my company, my advisory company is working with a specialist artificial intelligence company in order to optimize and automate cement plants. And PPC in the hook, rather than tires going to waste or landfill, they substitute coal and so are seen as a greener fuel. Something else which we as my company have been focusing on very intensely over the last 18 months is a replacement for clinker called calcined clay. Clay is available all over the world. The particular clay needed for this technology is pretty widespread. In Africa, it's very widespread. And the beauty of this is we can replace clinker, so the intermediate, the carbon intense product of cement, with calcined clay. Not totally, but we can reduce around about 35, 40% of the clinker. The beautiful thing is the calcined clay CO2 intensity is only 25% of clinker. And the first plant of the modern era, there had been some plants like this in South America, but the first plant of the modern era was again, first in Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, by a Brazilian Turkish company. So there's some great stuff happening. This technology is going to explode. There's going to be hundreds of these plants built over the next 5-7 years across the world. Carbon taxes. None of us really like taxes. They're necessary. Carbon taxes are going to be seen as a soft tax for governments across the world. There are 48 countries around the world with various forms of carbon taxes. And the higher the carbon tax, the greater the differentiation between a modern plant and an old plant, and a well-managed plant and a badly managed plant. And today, of all the clinker plants in the world, we have a utilization factor of only 58%. So increasing carbon taxes will push poor performers to close capacity, improve capacity. It steepens the cost curve, and in the last 18 months to 2 years, we have seen the cost of CO2, so the cost of polluting 1 ton of CO2 in Europe, go up from around 20 to 60, and it's going to keep going up. People are forecasting 100 euro per ton. It will make our product more expensive, but it will dramatically drive down carbon usage or carbon production. In South Africa, it's the one country at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa with a carbon tax. It's very low at the moment. It's 8 euros, but it's a starting point. Social, and I realize I'm probably using a bit too much time. I just want to talk about cement is important. Cement is not going away. Concrete is not going away. Building is not going to go away. We have such diversity between have not, good and bad, water, schooling, roads, all general infrastructure things. But we are getting a great deal of innovation happening in the industry. The industry is starting really to get moving on innovating, on evolving, on getting greener, getting genuinely greener in many cases. There's certainly greenwash here and there. And we see, I highlight 3 projects here, a British government with Lafarge project in Malawi, where they're 3D printing low-cost housing and schools, much less wastage, very quick, very effective. HGV driving, women truck drivers now of HGVs, and another Lafarge example, an incredible rehabilitation of a quarry, which gets 120,000 visitors a year on the coast by the factory in Mombasa. And we also need to talk governance. And there's a lot of companies are getting very, very nervous on government. Kingspan, which produced insulation, had a huge disaster. Some of you may see when sadly many people were killed in a tower in London through product issues. Dangote's had some rather horrendous crashes with his trucks in Nigeria. Holcim have been accused of working or funding ISIS. So Saint-Gobain, asbestos, cartel fines in South Africa, in Zambia. So there's a great deal more awareness, and I think the big companies are being much more careful on governance and on analyzing more carefully risks of failure. So to wrap up, we're talking South Africa now. The volume of cement, tons of cement sold in South Africa over the last 20 years has overall increased. There was a very big ramp up before the World Cup. It then dropped off dramatically and has now picked back up again. And in fact, 2020 and 2021 are running quite strongly. In cement, we look at, as a sort of macro definition of usage, we look at the consumption per capita. So South Africa's in the very low 200s. If we go to North Africa, that is running 500 up to 800. If we go to China, it's running over 1,000. So cement, concrete, building, there's huge need in South Africa and in the rest of the continent. That need's going to continue. It's not going to go away. So the only solution is to get better performance, dramatically reduce the amount of CO2 through all the levers that are applicable, whether it's technical, whether it's market, whether it's the mindset of everybody to do things slightly differently, whether it's taxes as the stick to assist with the carrots. So I think that's the South Africa picture. We look at the rest of Africa picture. The overall sub-Saharan Africa consumption per capita is half of that of South Africa. So the consumption is going to keep growing very dramatically across the continent. And I started this speech by saying that it's not governments who have solved the problem. It's not lobbyists who have solved the problem. It's not management, boards, leadership, chairmen who have solved these problems. The real drive of the change of mindset has become economic. The investors, ESG investors or other investors are saying, sorry, we're not going to do anything. And as you can see, if we look at the top there, the ratings, the MSCI ratings of the various companies are pretty variable. And if we look at Holcim, as they're now called, they were good. They went rapidly bad because the ratings agencies got more sophisticated. Holcim said, hang on, we've got to change this. Their share price got hammered, and suddenly they're back climbing up, being very well respected as probably the fastest mover in the improving their carbon footprint. And those are just some snapshots of the share prices. And just to conclude, because I say, I'm sorry I've gone on too long, but carbon is going to disrupt, transform our industry deeper and faster than anything has gone before it. You've got to be leading. And it's great to see PPC taking some great initiatives. The leaders will be the winners and will get the support of their shareholders. The others will fail. So I'll call it a day there. Thanks very much.
Thank you there, Tony. Indeed, over time, but we appreciate the content that has been shared thus far. And thank you very much. Let's go straight into the panel discussion without wasting any more time. Tony, you are welcome to stay with us if you desire. I think let me go to O.G. Williams, because I did hear that you do have to depart. Maybe just introduce yourself, your organization, and of course your sentiments around infrastructure. Please can we note that this is in partnership with PPC, who has sponsored this panel discussion. So thank you to them. O.G., over to you.
Thanks so much, Tabang, and good afternoon to everybody watching online and all of our panelists. So my name is O.G. Williams, and I am the Associate Director at Enon Africa. We're a consulting firm that does work across the entire continent in various industries, including those that Tony just touched upon. I have quite a bit of expertise in the energy space, which also relates to our discussion at the moment. And more recently, we've also done work within cement and metals and iron processing, which I think aligns quite well with the discussion at hand. So that's just a very quick introduction from me. I also don't want to take up a lot of time, but I can comment on quite a few of the things that Tony mentioned. But I think let's go around the table first, and then we'll come back to me.
Okay, thank you so much, Ogi. I was just worried about your time as you need to go, but if that's fine, then we will definitely go ahead. We have Scott, who's the studio principal at Little Diversified Architectural Consulting. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So yes, I'm a workplace principal, which for us is office space building, commercial interiors, and mixed-use projects. And Little Diversified Architectural Consulting, we just go by Little most of the time, is a large architectural firm. We have nearly 400 people across 5 offices up and down the East Coast and in LA. And we are, we practice in a number of different areas, workplace, retail, community, and healthcare. And we have supporting consulting engineering and a bunch of other services that go along with that. With regard to, well, I'll hold it there because I already sort of set the tone for comments to come. So I'll just leave that introduction where it is.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Mr. Lavender, Head of Technical at PPC Africa, welcome.
Thank you, Tabang. Yes, it's Kobus Govender. I'm Head of Technical at PPC, and it's a pleasure to be in the panel today. And the focus area, or one of the focus areas that I'm looking at, is in terms of how does PPC, transform itself, and what are the initiatives that we are looking at in order to move down the curve. And you've seen, those fancy curves from Tony, and how do we move down the curve in terms of making sure our products are lower in CO2 content.
Thank you very much. We have Professor Abimbola Windapo, who's the, of course, Professor at Construction Management in University of Cape Town. Welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Shabang. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Shabang has mentioned, my name is Abimbola Windapo. I'm a professor of construction management at the University of Cape Town, and my research focus is on sustainable construction. So this panel is very relevant to my research, and so it's a pleasure to be here. Shabang, do you want us to talk about what we view of sustainable infrastructure, or is that for later?
I think perhaps Ogi set the tone for us. So maybe you can just pause. Let's get intros from everybody, and then we'll continue.
Okay.
So
all right.
now, right on track. Thank you, Prof. Can we have Mr. Vishal Luchman? Is Vishal with us? Let me just check. No, Vishal is not here. Okay. Can we then have Mr. Campbell, Chris Campbell, CEO of CESA?
Hi, Tabang, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Campbell. I'm the CEO of Consulting Engineers, South Africa. We're essentially an industry association of consulting engineering companies. Have up to 600 member companies within South Africa, and we certainly, in the global environment, punch way above our weight. We're a member of the Federation of International Consulting Engineers, and we've recently been acknowledged in one of the prize giving categories around advocacy for engineering and consulting engineering. Myself, in person, I happen to be a civil engineer. Been in the industry for at least 40 years. So yeah, look forward to this discussion, but certainly look to broadening it beyond just the material that goes into construction as part of the sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. Absolutely, we are going to broaden it, and you are going to help us to do that. Been privileged to share a couple of panel discussions with you, so we look forward to that. Let's go back to you, Ogi. What are some of the aspects of Tony's presentation that you picked up that are worth us discussing on this panel discussion?
Sure, thanks, Tabang. I think Tony touched on quite a lot of important topics, and essentially infrastructure development is pretty intertwined across numerous sectors. It's not simply us talking about more efficiency in terms of the actual production of cement, for example, or even iron or steel, but we're also looking at how much energy do we consume in the course of that production. What is the efficiency on the bottom end in terms of CO2 emissions, the same as what Tony already alluded to. And one point that I wanted to actually touch on is more of a high-level view in terms of what's driving the motions and the developments in Africa per se. So I think probably the biggest elephant in the room that I just want to highlight right from the onset is that both in terms of steel and iron, as well as cement production, the overwhelming dominant force on the continent is China with all of its supplies. So it makes it quite difficult in terms of local capacity production and increasing local capacity production when you have a lot of cheap imports that are essentially coming into the country, or not only the country, but the continent. So what we've seen from our research over the last 12 months or so is that there is, well, it's actually a little bit more than 12 months, it's about 2 years going into this research phase. But what we have seen is that there is a realignment, internally speaking, when it comes to Africa's cement agenda, as well as metal and iron processing. So what we are seeing is a drive towards increasing local production and being able to actually produce a lot of the content locally and limiting the imports. And just like Tony said, we are essentially putting up some barriers in place to prevent a flood of these cheap imports. So how that picture is then transposing across the continent is that you see some of the larger players, they are starting to now consolidate their efforts, look for partnerships, look for strategic areas of opportunity. And in many of the markets, you might find a top 4 or a top 5 perspective where those companies are essentially controlling the entire market, but they're starting to also penetrate into the smaller players that are on the ground looking for a relationship that could be a cost saver, and at the same time starting to work towards those ESG initiatives which Tony mentioned. I think the one thing that there isn't as much attention on, but there is still a lot of attention on as well at the same time, is the energy consumption of all of the plants in place. So if we look at the agenda, the question in my mind, for example, would be which is going to be more cost effective and which is going to be faster? Would it be better for us to increase our energy efficiency in terms of consumption, or would it be better for us to decrease our CO2 emissions in terms of production? So you kind of have to look at both of them at the same time. If I had to look at all of the companies that we've been assessing over the last couple of years in terms of various projects, everybody's starting to actually chip away at both at the same time. So for those that have the capital buying power, they're starting to implement various off-grid solutions for power generation in terms of decreasing their consumption, which also has a beneficial knock-on impact of decreasing their costs. So that's one avenue. There's a lot of them that are actually working on an avenue because a lot of governments in Africa are already working on that as well. So it kind of joins together and aligns with the agenda of environmental protection. So in that sense, there is motions being made, which are positive. But in the context of actually making production more efficient, that is a little bit more of a gray area, but we do see that happening as well, particularly when looking at efficiency in terms of the turbines that those companies use or cement companies are using when looking at power generation. So if they can't get off grid, what other solutions are there to decrease the consumption of power? So what they're starting to look at is, for example, there are some companies that are looking at G&E, for example, looking at how can we increase our efficiency in terms of our production systems and our energy generation internally speaking, looking to improve on those methodologies in place. And at the same time, if we had to look a little bit further down the line, you're also still trying to compete in the market. So you've got to make sure that your costs and of production still match those of your competitors. Because if they've moved all the way forward, like Tony alluded to, in terms of efficiency, what are you doing on your side if you do not have that capacity domestically speaking? So you kind of have to balance the scales as much as you can, both in terms of how do we improve our existing operations, how do we get more energy off grid so that our costs drop, how do we get lower CO2 emissions, and at the same time tying all of that together, how do you actually provide employment opportunities, how do you provide sustainable development initiatives, and how do you raise them up to the foreground rather than only looking at the cost aspect, which I think is a big concern for a lot of the companies at the moment. But as I say, it's not the only one. There's a lot of things that everybody's working on at the same time. So I would unpack each one of those in a bit more depth, but let me just pause for a second because I think that there's a lot of things that the rest of the panel can also chip in on top of what I've just mentioned.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Augie. Scott, do you want to hop on to what Augie has just mentioned?
Sure. So my background is not directly in the construction side of things, though I did spend about 7 years in that industry before moving back into architecture and design. But I think one of the things that I have been focused on for the last 7 or 8 years is updating, I guess is the way to put it, or evolving the definition of sustainability beyond doing just a little bit less harm, a little bit of efficiency, et cetera, to a regenerative mindset, which is about beginning to heal the damage that we're doing. The reason I'm focused on it is because historically our industry, design, construction, development in general, has been probably one of the slowest to innovate in any way. Most of what we do is try to refine and be a little bit faster and a little bit cheaper the next time, but basically we follow the same process. And I think the biggest challenge that we have is that we're running out of runway, so to speak, before we are at a crisis that we can't turn back from. And in order for us to do that, I think we have to we must do all of those things to press down on power usage, consumption, CO2 production, et cetera. But we also have to get outside of our normal framework and start thinking about the connective nature of the systems that we're talking about, especially with regard to infrastructure. It is a necessary part of our lives continuing, the ability to facilitate commerce, the ability to connect people, but we kind of have to do it in a different way. The only other thing I was going to say is that in a looking at it from a regenerative standpoint, we really have to factor in human, social, financial, and environmental aspects and find the balance for those things that allows us to continue to develop with respect to nature as opposed to stamping it out and dropping our waste everywhere as we go. And I think that's an existential challenge, not just a financial one, but that's part of what I see as the biggest problems we're dealing with today.
Thank you so much, Scott. Much appreciated. Let's go to Professor Abimbola. Can you define sustainability in the context of construction?
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. So I'm back. So in the context of construction, we define sustainability as in terms of environmental and socio-economic perspectives. That is, sustainability is looked at in two ways. So there's an environmental side, and then you have the socio-economic perspective to it. So, but when we're looking at the sustainable infrastructure and we're looking at the socio-economic perspective, we're looking at infrastructure that can pay for itself. So it's something that it's needed. So either it has benefits, it has like health benefits, and then or the infrastructure itself can pay. And then it creates employment during its development. It creates economic opportunities for businesses. It creates opportunities for skills development. And then it's healthy and it's safe for people to stay in it. So in terms of collapsed building, collapsed bridges and flooding. So it's something that creates this kind of very good environment. And so when we look at materials as well, and Tony touched on the material, the cement material, and he mentioned its context and the view people have about it. So yes, cement is very important. It's one of the most important material that we have in construction, but it has been found to have a very huge impact. So I said, we measure sustainability in terms of environments and socio-economic benefits.
Right.
So, but so it has a very huge impact on the environment in terms of its energy consumption and CO2 emissions, which Tony explained. And there are certain subcategories for cement in our studies, which recognize that we need to reduce the embodied energy and resource depletion that's occurring through the use and mining of resources when cement is being produced. But I didn't hear this coming out clearly. So how do we reduce that embodied energy within that cement uses? It uses a lot of energy, and I think one of the panelists mentioned this as well. It creates a lot of resource depletion, environmental degradation, and such things like that. And then also the local sourcing of materials is important in terms of the materials we use in constructing sustainable infrastructure.
Sure.
And Tony mentioned the Dangote trucks in Nigeria that is used in trucking cement from the factory. And this has posed a huge environmental challenge because it leads to destruction of roads. You know, cement is very heavy. So this has led to destruction of roads. It has also increased transportation emissions because trailers are used that use diesel. So it's increased transportation emissions. So it's not clear. So my vision is that cement should be, we could produce cement locally where it's needed the most for infrastructure. And I also had a panelist say we have 4 huge cement manufacturing companies globally that control the cement trade. How can this be broken down to make sure that cement is closer to where it's needed? We don't need to truck cement, we don't need to ship it. It's produced closer in order to reduce transportation emissions. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. We can now go to Mr. Govender. Perhaps you would like to extend on that.
Thanks, Tabang. You've seen some of the curves that Tony has put down in the PPC numbers that is highlighted there, and it shows our commitment in terms of reducing the CO2 content in cement. And the focus in the last 10 and a bit years has mainly been to asset optimization, asset rationalization, which has taken us down from where we were 10, 12 years ago. But I think we've also started to focus a bit in terms of moving forward in terms of alternate fuels. We've tried and proven the concept of using tires, as instead of coal, and replacing some of the coal in our facility at De Hoek. So from a concept point of view and technical point of view, we've proven that, and we would look at extending that into some of our other operations. I think also in terms of alternate fuels in the DRC and in Rwanda, we've looked at palm kernels, as using that as alternate fuels. So that's been in operation as well. So we've managed to get down the curve by moving away from into different types of fuels that we use in our process. I think we've also advanced the process that we're currently in South Africa with regards to using renewable energy. So we're quite far down the line, in using that, both in terms of embedded generation as well as winning them over the grid. So that process is underway, and we hope to close some of those things in the near future. And then clinker substitutes. There's quite a bit of talk on, and it was mentioned earlier in this panel as well, in terms of calcined clay. We're currently in an advanced feasibility stage for calcined clay to be used in our facility. So that will also help in terms of moving towards reducing our footprint. And then lastly, I think in terms of alternate business technologies, we are in discussions with various parties in terms of using alternate business technologies as part of construction management. We're quite confident that this will give us added benefit in terms of where we're moving. I think using these things, introducing the alternate fuels, implementing and moving forward in implementing clean energy projects, as well as we are quite committed to aligning to the UN's sustainable development goals, starts to position us well in terms of moving down, in terms of CO2 content, CO2 emissions in our facilities. Thanks, Tabang.
Thank you so much, Mr. Govender. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, quite a critical comment that you added there. Perhaps would you like to extend, Mr. Campbell?
Bang, thank you. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of a different take on how much broader sustainability, the thoughts on sustainability need to, how they need to be broadened. you know, I could easily be tempted, having been in a precast concrete environment, I could easily be tempted to get into a detailed conversation on cement and concrete and so forth. But I think it would be remiss of me to not add that much to the points made by our colleagues from the cement industry, and those are the improvements that are required. I wonder sometimes about some of the projects that related to the reduction of the use of cement in concrete and other admixtures. But to Professor Abibola's point as well is, what are the causes related to infrastructure that's not sustainable, collapsed buildings and bridges or overutilized roads? And I think what we need to do is take quite a few steps back and look at, do governments and South African government in particular, do we of necessity start our processes correctly in terms of the sustainable investment in infrastructure? And what has been missing in that equation, and you know, it's great to have a construction boom and build a whole lot of things all at once, but you've got to also ask yourself whether you need all of that. Has there been a due process to inform your investment in all of that infrastructure, or are you going to have to now look for a use for it afterwards? It's easy to be tempted in the infrastructure environment to pursue what looks nice and what looks workable. A case in point in our country is this zealous pursuit of bus rapid transit systems. I am not even sure there was a proper integrated transport study done to inform whether we need it or not. It looked good in Brazil when they first started implementing it, but no sooner had it then become saturated. So did we look at other transport modes? Now, what's the starting point? And the starting point has to be that if we're going to develop infrastructure, we've got to appreciate the life cycle costs of that infrastructure. You're going to own it for the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Oh.
And contrary to how the process should work, firstly, we don't of necessity follow proper project life cycle processes to ensure that you are making the right choice.
Yeah.
And then you also fail to include the life cycle ownership aspects of this infrastructure. So, you know, in layman's terms, if I were to talk about life cycle ownership, it's the simple analogy of the printer and the cartridges. Do I buy a cheap printer, or do I look at what do the cartridges cost me? Because if I'm going to run this thing for the next 20 to 30 years, what's the better, sorry, not a printer though, for the next 5 years, what's the best option? Infrastructure is no different. But guess what? We go to our professional service providers, the architects, the engineers, and everyone, and we squeeze the life out of their fee. And yet we expect sustainable, innovative designs and solutions to these problems that make sure that your bridge doesn't collapse, that your building doesn't collapse, that there's innovation in the thinking around building ESG and environmental resilience in our infrastructure. But the 2% cost of you owning that life cycle is in the professional fees. You squeeze that bubble so hard and you leave on the table the savings that could be derived in the construction process, which is normally about 20%. And even worse, the 78% or so of your cost of ownership is in operations and maintenance. We tend to forget about that. And then we wonder why this doesn't last you 30 years. it starts failing well in advance, or it needs more intense maintenance. So I think we need to look at this process holistically and really look at how can you use your professions to maximize the sustainability of your infrastructure. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
I see Scott there has, nodded his head, clapped his hands. Scott is just like, give this man a buzz. Scott, maybe can you come in this respect and tell us exactly what tantalized you?
Sure. No, I think Chris is spot on in his assessment, although I wouldn't say it's only that we get squeezed on the fees for design. We get squeezed on the budget. We get squeezed on the budget for the construction as well. And that's a lot of, I think historically, we have taken the path of least resistance to almost every solution without looking at life cycle, without looking at circular economy aspects. And that's led to expedience, cost effectiveness in most cases, but also unintended consequences because we're not planning for things and we're not maintaining things the way we should. I could give you some examples from America in terms of the latest Society for Civil Engineering's every 4 years, they give the country a grade on our infrastructure. And currently we're at a C minus 2021 grade, with a call for $2.6 trillion in investment over the next decade in order to help get it back up on its feet and operating well. And that ranks us 13th worldwide in infrastructure quality for the richest country in the world. That's a pretty poor indication of how we actually think about and plan for and execute these things. So I think he's right. I think, one of the things that we have to look at is the interrelated nature of aspects of infrastructure that we solve in silos instead of as a system, because I think we waste tons of money, effort, and time to try to get through, to cut through one thing at a time instead of looking at it holistically. We have an aging infrastructure for water distribution that I think we have a water main break every 2 minutes in this country. And that leads to something like 6 billion gallons of treated water lost on an annual basis, because we're not spending money proactively to maintain at the right level. Same thing with last mile distribution of electricity, which is very susceptible to climate issues now, and is going to get worse and worse. And I don't even know how much that costs in terms of misproduction and other repairs. $9 billion in damages every year for stormwater management issues in urban flooded areas, which is poor design or minimal code level design instead of assessment. And we continue to look backwards for our benchmarking instead of forwards to the ever increasing risk associated with climate change impact. So I agree, we really do have to shake up the way we plan for these things and the way we fund them with an eye towards a longer view, and not just the first 5 years of execution. And once it's done, we hand it off and hope it lasts forever.
Wow. No, I don't, I've never been left speechless on a subject matter that I don't specialize in. Wow. Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Before we go to Mr. Govender, I think maybe, okay, if you can come in there. You mentioned something, Scott, that I find it's worth exploring, which I think was mentioned by Mr. Campbell, about proactive use of money. Mr. Campbell said we need to follow due process to inform investment. I think that's very critical. Okay, maybe can you advise what can we do to be proactive in investing in the construction industry, or how can we proactively use money in that space? I know you spoke a lot about increasing local capacity. That's an area of investment and so forth. So maybe let's go a bit deeper on that.
All right, thanks, Tabang. Just to cycle back to the Prof's comment about the 4 companies, I meant that in the context, a general context. But if you want an actual example, we can look at Nigeria, where Dangote, Lafarge, and BUA Group basically control the entire market. So it makes it very difficult for any smaller entrants to even register a blip on the screen.
Sure.
But just in terms of the point about financing, so it is a bit of a catch-22. So let's use Egypt as an example. They are currently the biggest cement manufacturer on the continent. Their capacity is significantly larger than South Africa's, and they've been increasing local capacity significantly over the last few years. And they've gotten it to a point where they're actually basically squeezing out the international players because they've got so much local capacity. Now, it's a good thing in the sense that, sure, it's going to drop the cost of cement. But on the flip side, the government has also imposed a reduction in fuel subsidies. So now all of a sudden, one of the big drivers of your cost reduction, i.e. the ready availability of fuel at a cheap price, is gone out the window. So looking at it from the perspective of those operating on the ground, the equation is, it's quite easy for them to solve. All right, where else can we draw energy from that's going to be cheaper? And unfortunately, that's now going backwards, because the cheapest sources of energy are still going to be the fossil fuel sources at this present moment. So that's been happening in Egypt, for example. They've actually been looking at what other sources of fuel can we utilize, including coal, to power up these plants. And we also see a similar situation in Tanzania, where they're now putting on the pedestal an agenda to build a 1,200 megawatt coal-fired power plant to actually supply one of the biggest cement manufacturing facilities in East Africa. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot depending on which way we want to go. If we want to increase local production and make sure that local companies have a better standing or an equal footing in front of international players that have already got much better capacity and more advanced technologies, etc., we need to provide them with a conducive environment. But how are we really doing that? We're basically saying to them, well, there's other sources that you guys can use. So although coal is one of the gray and negative areas in this regard, there are some positives. There's obviously a shift towards gas as a big driver of power consumption, and very importantly, as a result of it being very flexible in terms of turning on and off in comparison to a coal-fired power plant, for example. So we are seeing that. And in parallel, to go on to your point, what we are seeing is that international institutions, including the big organizations like the African Development Bank and even more local players, like, for example, even our own South Africa's Nedbank, they are starting to place more emphasis on investments in green technologies and green infrastructure development. And to a point where I do believe that Nedbank's actually planning on stopping investment in any new oil and gas projects over the next decade. So they're not going to be the only ones. Everybody else is going to essentially start falling behind the leaders in that regard, which is then going to place all of the companies looking for financing, or even governments looking to get financing for projects, in a pretty tight situation. So now, what does that mean for all of us? We've got to get creative with how we're actually sourcing this financing and where is it being directed. And I think that if you have to look at the bigger picture again, the aim is to diversify the risk so that you're not overexposed in one place. So if energy consumption is one of the problems, all right, let's try and address that with modular designs, that we don't have to necessarily utilize power from the grid. If technology efficiency is one of the other problems, fine, let's increase the capacity, or let's streamline the capacity and the generation of production lines so that we're actually producing both in terms of cost and power, which then essentially pulls us into a competitive space and still aligns with our ESG initiatives. So we kind of have to look at the whole picture together. And on top of all of that, we obviously have the competition, right? So even though each one of us might be representing a different company and we have a different agenda, there's others with different agendas of their own. And we have to kind of figure out, well, where's our place going to be and how are we going to position ourselves in the context of every other player on the market, and at the same time, align with all of the development initiatives and start moving towards that energy transition. Because it's on the go. There's no stopping that. It's just a question of how do you align to that? Because if we do not actually start to move some of the pieces together at the same time, you might find that down the line, if you've been overexposed to generate too much of your power or power for production from coal, for example, and all of a sudden the government says, right, we're imposing a 30% carbon tax on all power plants, your cost is going to drive through the roof, regardless of how you look at it. So you've got no choice. You have to move into the renewable space in order to decrease your costs and align with the government's initiatives on ESG. So on the financing side, to touch on your question, Tabang, you have to start putting in place the motions that show that you are going in the right direction. So even though right now it might be a slow go, 10 years from now, it's going to be a lot further down the line. And again, I refer to the oil and gas companies are the easiest ones that we can pick at, even though they don't align with our topic at hand. Some of them have started to move towards the green energy agenda. I think BP is one of the biggest ones. Others have not. If I look at, for example, ExxonMobil, they're still pretty much in the way that they were doing things 10, 15 years ago. So everybody's got a different agenda. Everybody's looking for a different avenue to position themselves in the market. And on top of all of that, we've got local issues and local challenges that we all need to align with. So it's quite a melting pot of challenges and opportunities at the same time, which I think most of the panelists are already aware of in their own way for different sectors that they're working in and different type of avenues that they're exploring in terms of development. So that would be my main comment in terms of financing. We would have to diversify our sources of production of energy and increase our efficiency in terms of our own use of technology. Those are the two big points if we want to try and generate financing in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Ogi. I'm just moving quickly to you, Mr. Governor, and then we'll go to Professor Abimbola. I think maybe I just want to ask, what has PPC done, PPC Africa specifically, what have they done to increase local capacity? Have they partnered with, SMMEs, local producers in the cement industry? What are the current programs that are in place? Mr. Governor?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we've quite active in SMME development in small enterprises. We go through and take them through bricklaying courses, brick making, plastering courses. So it's more than just it's about empowering those communities because they're part of the value chain, and and in the use of our products, but also in terms of downstream beneficiation and creating opportunities for them to grow in that space in terms of building materials in that area. So it is quite active. It's formal top of our agenda, and it's part of the standard course of our business. And on the ESG side, it sort of fits under the social part of ESG, and that's where we've got active involvement. We put in technical resources in order to support them and drive that as well. So it's a key strategic focus area for the organization.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Abimbola.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Please go ahead, just as an extension to what Mr. Governor has said. I know you had issues of sustainability earlier on, defining what sustainability in construction is. Maybe you can extend on what all the other panelists have shared thus far, especially in your space around education. What are you doing to provide better information in the sector?
Yeah, so we're doing research. Just to touch on the local empowerment of companies, I think maybe the cement companies could do more as well in terms of, I don't know if it's going to be possible to also set up local industries as well. I don't know what the difficulty will be, maybe in terms of where you could find the materials for making cement. Maybe that's what's making it difficult to have local industries and people being empowered in that type of, in those types of industries to be able to contribute to their community, so that the cement is not being manufactured elsewhere and then we have to be trucking that cement over 800 kilometers to where it's going to be required. So maybe more micro kind of plants that could manufacture cement, because I had Tony mentioning that there was somewhere where they were actually adding lime to cement, and they said it would make it better. So maybe it's possible to have that kind of micro industries within the cement in manufacturing supply chain. And we've seen what happened during COVID, which also affected the supply chain. So we don't want to see construction being halted because of lack of supplies. So if it's a local thing, it's going to help very much to address issues of COVID pandemic and so on, if it ever occurs again. And so what we teach students, because materials are very important, they cost about 60% of the cost of infrastructure. So we research into materials at UCT, and we're also doing research into alternative building materials. But Tony also mentioned the mindset of people. People always want a concrete structure. They want a brick and mortar structure, bricks, which we use cement and so on. They wouldn't want to live in alternate materials like mud houses, or adobe structures, and so on. So there's a mindset out there that those structures are they are connected, or they are related to poverty. And people don't want to be associated with poverty. So they say you are living in a mud house, or you are living in a kind of timber building. So no one wants to be associated with poverty. So cement has been seen as a status symbol. So you have to live in a cement house. So we are teaching students to research into these materials, trying to also enlighten people about the benefits of using locally sourced materials, the environmental benefits, what this is doing to the environment if we use materials that are sourced locally, and with the local people, also the local construction industry can use, because you can make use of local expertise. But if they don't know how to use it, if you import materials, then also you have to import the labor. And then there's this tension. You find out in the construction industry a lot. There's this tension between where you have, they say there are these business gangs that they invade construction sites. It's because most companies cannot find the local skilled labor to work on those projects, because they import most of their materials from, it might be within South Africa, but when we say import, that means you're taking a conventional material and using it in a local space. So they import this material, they have to import the skills as well. And so there's this tension within the local communities and the construction company. So we want to see more of the use of local materials, and we do teach this, we do research into it. We hold workshops as well on the use of local materials that we find will be of benefits to use in different areas of South Africa. So we've done of the research into this, and we've come up with a lot of findings, which we also publish. We write articles and we also publish them and present our findings at conferences and also at workshops. So the time will not allow me to do that here. So, but that's what we do in the university.
Thank you so much, Prof. Appreciate that. Just lastly, I think I'm gonna give this one to Scott and Mr. Campbell and you, Mr. Govender. Then we'll have our closing remarks. Scott, I really, without fear of contradiction, I want to challenge the statement you made earlier on to say, okay, you did mention that you only have been exposed to the construction sector maybe for 7 years now, you're in design, and maybe there's not much of an interlink. But I beg to differ. I believe design truly influences the construction sector in so many ways. Like now we have your green building, which I think is challenging the construction sector to say, what materials are you sourcing, and are they biodegradable? Do they contribute to sustainability? Can they help in reducing carbon emissions? Can they help towards, like I said, sustainable building and so forth? So what is the future of construction in the context of design? So I'm going to ask you that question. And then Mr. Campbell, also, how do you think we should then change policy, or what should we add in policy and legislation to ensure that foreign direct investments are well informed, and not just informed but thoroughly directed, that we don't just end up with, I mean, for goodness sake, we are cutting down trees. We now have to drive so far just to see a tree and to breathe freely, for example. So what can we do? How can we become more focused and more specific in the industry? And then Mr. Governor, maybe on your side, has PPC Africa, are they intending to diversify? Especially that you guys are doing cement and so forth, but is there any intention to diversify, to even use cement, in different ways or in different forms that could potentially benefit the construction industry, not just in building? I know that with Sasol, a lot of their fine coal is necessary for the cement industry, because fine coal, whatever that is left from their production, helps with the production of cement. So there's different value chains. Has PPC Africa thought about diversifying and also investing in different value chains? So maybe let's go back to Scott. Then after that, we'll have our closing remarks and wrap up the session. Scott?
Okay, I'm going to try to make sure I didn't forget the question and all that. The future of design with regard to sustainability. Well, I think I said earlier, first I wasn't disavowing that we're engaged and connected with things like infrastructure. I recognize that we have, in the design field, we have an influence on those things in terms of implementing new technologies, more earth-friendly materials, etc. I do think that in a large part we're beholden to the cost equation in that regard, and even more, as I talked about our lack of innovation. I think we're slow to see cutting edge technologies adopted quickly. Most institutional owners, developers want to see something that's sort of tried and true. They think they don't want to be the guinea pig that might risk failure of a system in a building because it's new. So I'll come back to the idea that regeneration is really the way design has to evolve. We have to think of it as connected to the environment, the community that it's a part of, any project that we're working on. And we have to look at not just the initial cost or the speed at which we can get it into market, but we have to look at its impact in that community, what the value is it's going to bring, how will it be viable and therefore sustainable over time. And in order to do that, I think a lot of factors have to come into play. Again, since the system itself is what is continually being knocked out of balance. I was thinking a little bit earlier, I think it was a comment that Augie made about, I'm sorry, it was Cruz, about the environmental social governance aspect of things. And I feel like, we finally made a step into that realm where investment requires transparency on sustainability and social equity. And that needs to be coupled with government supporting that investment in a different way. Perhaps better tax rates for the ones who are developing things in that manner. would be a good way to tie those together and kind of speed up that whole process of people only putting their money into things that are more sustainably designed and executed. I think that kind of covers the basis of the question. And just to say that, it is not something that any one facet of our industry can tackle. It has to be done like holding hands and all aimed in the same direction.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Campbell?
So, Tabang, I think, to your question, first of all, the kinds of changes that I'm seeing in approaches proposed by government in South Africa, at least, certainly are positive. If I look at the Infrastructure South Africa process, there's a stronger move towards not throwing good money after bad, and ensuring that we invest in the correct infrastructure, following proper due process, and ensuring then that it's money well spent.
Sure.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we will face, I think, not only in South Africa, but also globally. I looked at there's a report on prepared by the Federation of International Consulting Engineers, and they estimate that infrastructure investment needs to be about $94 trillion.
Sure.
Should have been between 2016 and 2040. And that would mean that one has to invest an average of about $3.7 trillion per year, US dollars, that is. We can convert it to rands. But here's the problem. We all do it at the same time. We all want to do it in the shortest space of time. And then we find that there's a vacuum. And so the cyclic nature of how we spend and invest in infrastructure policy has to also be formulated to ensure there's a sustainability in the investment patterns, so that we get away from the feast and famine phenomenon, which is typical of infrastructure investments. Because if you continue to do that, you'll never have enough capacity.
Sure.
You'll never have enough skills in any one country, so we cannibalize all of the time. Materials, there would be that kind of a challenge. Would there be enough materials? Would there be enough equipment? So certainly what has to inform the investment patterns is to take the exceptionally cyclic nature out of this investment infrastructure and try and smooth it out as best as possible. I mean, you never get it perfectly right, but we have to move away from, and if I can use the example, in South Africa, around about 2009, 8, 9, 10, 11, loads and loads and loads of projects, not enough capacity. What has happened between then and now? We've gone into total trough, and now we plan and hope to go into another peak, which sounds nice, it's good, but long may that continue. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It shouldn't happen and then be over. So certainly, I think policy and planning has to inform the process that one embarks on. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Governor, do you want to come in there? And we have our closing remarks.
So thanks, Taba. Yeah, I mean, in terms of using cement in different forms or creating different value chains, as you mentioned. Yes, replacing or using alternative fuels, as I mentioned, from a tire perspective. So it creates a value chain in terms of, the packaging of the tires, the logistics, and getting them there, and it takes away the landfill. So that creates job opportunities all the way through, and in terms of that, and also fits in terms of from a policy point of view, from a waste management perspective. I think added to that, I indicated RDF, refuse-derived fuels. So, these are, all the refuse that goes into landfills. So, those things, what we would looking at is an enabler in terms of, it will solve your waste management challenges that we have in the country, but it also creates the value chain in terms of sorting of waste, packaging, and getting them into the right form, and getting them transported to the locations that we operate in, and using them into as energy source. So I think those are some of the things that we've that we're currently looking at. And I think I also mentioned alternate business technology and solutions. So that's how do we bring in more greener technology, and it'll help in terms of quicker buildings, and buildings that use a more eco-friendly products as well. So that also comes in. So those are very different value chains in which it could start growing and giving us different opportunities, but also solving other problems at the same time.
Thank you very much there, Mr. Governor. We are now going to have our closing remarks from all our panelists. Perhaps let's start with Mr. Williams, Ogie, and then we'll have Prof. Even if it's one liner, just tell us about the future of sustainable construction or infrastructure development in your thoughts, and also to say how can we move forward? We've got to have these platforms in the years to come and just talk about different challenges and contextualize it differently. So this has closing remarks. We'll start with you, Ogie, then we'll go to Professor Bola, and then Scott, Campbell, and Governor.
Thanks, Tabang. I think probably the best example that I can draw on is Apple. 40 years ago, the way that Apple thought about designing their devices was quite new, very fresh. Nobody was really doing it. As time evolved, those devices became even better and more in tune with what the consumer would want. I think probably one of the biggest pivotal things that I remember from documentaries and even movies that I've seen is the time when Steve Jobs was actually not the CEO of Apple, and there was another leader at the helm because the board deemed him to be unfit. So essentially what they try to put out a new device. At the time, it was one of those touchpads. You've got a pen and you're touching the pad and you're doing the thing, but it didn't succeed. The question mark was, why is this not succeeding? The technology is innovative and it provides you with a lot more to think about and a lot more flexibility. And in one of the scenes in one of these movies, the response from Steve Jobs' character is, it's not going to succeed because you're disabling the other 4 fingers that you have on that hand by utilizing only the pen at the front. So it's going to have to take a mindset like that to essentially tell the consumer and everybody else, well, there's a different way to look at it. The problem that I think we have, holistically speaking, is it's kind of like a waiting game. You're waiting for somebody to take that first step. Nobody wants to take the first step, especially those guys that have the most to lose. Everybody at the top has the most to lose unless they start to move. So somebody more towards the middle or the bottom has that flexibility to take the risk. And in my mind, we need to have more of those types of companies that are actually taking the risk forward. Because when they start taking those risks, you will find that all of the bigger corporates are going to have to start aligning behind them. So it's just about somebody taking the first step and starting to move with it, irrelevant of what the criticism may be. Because good ideas are normally shut down at the beginning. And later on, when they actually start to gain traction and they become very profitable, everybody wants a share of it, right? But at that stage, it's too late. So somebody just needs to bite the bullet and take those first steps, even though right now it might result in a drop in share price by 10% or whatever the case may be because of the announcement. Somebody needs to be bold. It's the same point that I raised earlier when I was talking about BP as the example, moving away from oil and gas production and exploration. If those guys are doing it, then somebody else is doing it as well. And it's all about taking that first step. So that would be my main comment. Innovation in the space and thinking differently, exactly as the same as Apple did back in the day and still continues to do as much as they can.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Prof?
Thank you very much. So in terms of what we've been saying so far, my own recommendations would be that we have to look at using lean manufacturing processes, reducing energy in the manufacturing of our materials, looking at areas like transportation, most especially, which increases the cost of this material. So more on transportation, more on locally sourced materials. Yeah. So reducing energy, using lean processes, green materials. So if the cement, and I hear Mr. Govinda when he says they are looking at alternative sources of energy in the manufacturing processes of cement. So if the cement can be manufactured in such a way that it's green, and then, but also in a kind of local way so that it's much more available where we really need to use these materials, then I recommend that. And then also the consultants as well, in their considerations of materials. I also hear things about cost, the cost of the consultants' fees that are being chopped away. So I think there needs to be more consideration of the type of materials that they are proposing for use in the construction of new buildings. And we're also looking at other alternative forms, new construction methods that makes use of, I had 3D printing and making use of innovative, like agreement. I saw agreement behind you just now. Innovative alternative methods of construction, and how do we sell this? How do we make people aware that these types of materials are available for use and they come at cheap? So there's also the affordability aspect of sustainability, which we do not really touch on. So how affordable are these materials? Housing is not affordable. So how can we make these materials affordable for most people so that they live in better accommodation? So thank you very much.
That's quite profound to end off. So thank you so much. Though we didn't talk about it, but I think going forward, it's something that is worth engaging on. Thank you very much. Mr. Covenden, or did I say Mr. Campbell? Or did I say Scott? Scott,
I think you said Scott first.
It's the end of the day. Wow, a jam-packed day. I'm so sorry about that. Scott.
So thank you. I think I'd like to piggyback a little bit on some things that Augie said about the way towards innovation. It is going to take an ExxonMobil or a BP or someone like that to see a way to not play defense with the things that they've already accomplished, the market share they have, whatever, but to actually see the writing on the wall that we're inside of 30 years to a tipping point we may not be able to come back from right. a climate standpoint. And they can either ride that until we crash over the edge, or they can lead the way. They've got the deepest pockets, they've got the most influence in regards to that, and they should be more willing to push that envelope to see how they can take the next steps towards whatever the new market is going to be and how to own a share of that. That's obviously renewables in all forms, right. So that we are not doing damage. I think the other thing that collectively we have to think about, and it starts at the design level, but it goes all the way through our process of building and construction, is what's the impact beyond our immediate project. Understanding that changes the design decisions that you make, so that you are more mindful of equity and the hopefully positive ways that you can influence that surroundings, and rather than the negative ways, or that you do the most to mitigate what might be considered a negative process aspect of it or outcome. Mm-hmm. So that goes back in my mind. I meant to mention this earlier, that starting in university in the education that we give our children, we have to change the way they see things. It's already happened. My kids are much more aware of these issues than I ever was coming through my career. And hopefully, when they finally get the reins and are in charge of most things, we'll be in better shape. But we still are running the risk of leaving them a pile of rubble instead of something they can actually work with. So I would just say that that those things matter the most right now, is the connectivity of understanding the connectivity of the things that we're doing, and planning accordingly.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you. That was a great way to end off, especially the mitigation aspect. I think that's very, very critical. Thank you. Mr. Campbell and then Mr. Governor.
Yes, thank you. And you know, I certainly, you know, if you take what happened with the Industrial Revolution and how basic the approaches were and how much development has taken place since then, I think many of us have become more aware. If there's still denialists around climate change, then I wonder where they've been, because certainly we've seen these extremes in different parts of the world. So approaches to how we've done things in the past have to change. You've got to future-proof the infrastructure that we consider developing, along with the resilience and the consciousness of how do we, having learned from the past, you know, I think it would be nice to have a crystal ball, but also start thinking a little bit harder about how might you mitigate further damage, you know, several years down the line for future generations. I think we come back to the classical definition of what do we call it, sustainability, preserving the present for future generations. And that's really where we need to, as a society, need to be a lot more conscious and a lot less consumptive. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. That was great. Mr. Governor?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, just two areas, I think, you know, in terms of, you know, sustainability and moving forward with where it is. I mean, it's both a business and a social imperative. You know? So it's about adapting to that. And the second one, you know, it's part of value creation. You know, I mean, if you take those things through, you know, it becomes an obligation in terms of how one wants to move forward. Okay, but you can contextualize it in that, you know, in that way.
Right. Oh, that's it. Full stop, Mr. Governor.
Yes, short and sweet.
Wow. Thank you so much. You know, I'm a PPC. That's why you are a partner. We really appreciate contributors like you. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that really brings us to the end of this panel discussion. Thank you so much for your contribution. I really believe that there is more. And in that regard, Beverly and Cape Media will be in touch with you. Would love to just hear more and see how can we take this forward beyond dialogue and engagement, particularly from a continental and a global approach. So thank you so much for your time. And I see you have all added your email addresses. So Beverly will be in touch and we can see how we can all bring this together. But we truly appreciate your time and everything that you have mentioned thus far. We learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
out there, you are so strong. If you've been with us from 9 o'clock till now, thank you for your patience. And we're looking forward to read more of your comments. That was the Sustainable Infrastructure Seminar in partnership with PPC. Absolutely phenomenal panel of experts. And thank you so much to our keynote address, Mr. Hidley, who really set the foundation for the talk. And from me, I just want to say we appreciate your participation. Please don't forget to hashtag SAS Summit 21 and also to visit our virtual exhibition. Tomorrow is our last day and it's going to be concluding the Sustainability Summit, and it's my birthday tomorrow. So I'm going to see you same time, same place, and we're looking forward to engaging with you further. Adios for today. Thank you.